So in the book, as the question kind of suggests, I have a series of case studies, different platforms that I look at, different objects, digital objects. And for each of these case studies, then I kind of typify them, right, as one kind of hate. And so one way to talk about this is then to step through these kinds of types of hate in a way. So the first then is about friendly hate. And this is the chapter really on Gab. So Gab is a alt tech platform. It's a platform that very much looks like Facebook or Twitter or these kind of mainstream tech platforms. It's very easy to pick up. It's very intuitive. It's got a great user experience. And you think about interfaces and features and so on, right? And so in that sense, then it occupies this kind of middle space that I talk about between these really mainstream platforms like Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and so on, and then these very niche platforms traditionally associated with hate, such as Stormfront, 4chan, 8chan, and so on, which have a much kind of more learning curve, much more niche, considered to be a kind of a cesspool of the internet, right? A very kind of dark place for a very particular kind of audience, right? And so these alt tech platforms then allow people to say whatever they want to say, right? Their whole driver, their whole promise is free speech. This is a platform for the people, right? That we won't censor or regulate any of this material so long as it's not illegal. And so, but at the same time, then they provide this very accessible kind of interface that very much clones mainstream platforms, right? We see then the way in which I call it the friendly face of hate, right? It allows users to kind of step very easily into these platforms. And even when we step onto the front page of these platforms, we often get kind of material that we consider to be edgy or controversial, right, in some ways, but not necessarily hate in the sense of having explicit language, hate, racial slurs, right, these kinds of things. And so for me, these platforms really provide this kind of friendly face of hate that sit between these mainstream platforms and these niche hate communities, a really accessible pathway into these ideas. Even in the front page, then we're kind of eased into this kind of environment. But then only a few clicks away, when you dig into people's profiles, into their messages and so on, we can quickly ramp up the degree of more explicit hate, right? The kinds of claims and language that we start to see in the platform. So that's friendly hate. We can think about playful hate. Playful hate is the chapter on 4chan and 8chan, so-called chans, right? And I call it playful hate because it's a very particular community, right, that occupies these spaces, tends to be sort of a young white male, a little bit stereotypical, right, very much emerged from a kind of a internet subculture around anime, manga, gaming, right, and the packaging of these ideas are often, you know, using memes, using internet vernacular, using a particular kind of language, irony, and so on, right, to really propagate these ideas. And so in that sense, I suggest that this form of hate is very much calibrated to this community, right? This kind of playful hate that's very much sort of memeified or gamified. And even, unfortunately, in sort of real world incidents of violence linked to 4chan and 8chan, for example, we see the way in which there are hashtags written on a person's gun, right? Or ways in which their sort of explanation of the event, right, is written as a FAQ, frequently asked questions. The whole act itself then becomes this kind of gamified, internet-specific kind of act geared towards a particular internet community. And in that sense, very much plays into a certain kind of logic, plays into certain kinds of language and vernacular, and is a kind of a novel, again, versioning of hate, I think. Righteous Hate is the chapter on QAnon. And in this chapter, then, I talk about, right, the kind of phenomenon of QAnon, this sort of meta-conspiracy theory. I talk about how it really blends in some ways this kind of very particular mixture of sort of spiritual, Christian fundamentalist, apocalyptic kind of language used by Q in Q's posts, very much constructs these kind of apocalyptic narratives about the children of light versus the children of darkness, right? About the end of the world, about some kind of cosmic struggle, right? That these keyboard warriors can then derive meaning from, derive a kind of sense of purpose, right? It makes sense of the world. It seems to fit, right? For the believer, it tends to fit the kinds of current events and figures that they see in the world, right? And then in that sense, very much provides this kind of drive forward, this ability to find, meaning and purpose. But that sort of religious iconography narrative is blended in a really interesting way with a kind of skepticism, right? A sort of rationality, sort of post-enlightenment kind of thing where we don't need to believe everything. We should test things. We should be rational, right? The QAnon slogan is do your own research. And we see this kind of drive then play out in the way in which QAnoners, right, consume endless hours of video. They screenshot things. They take pictures of license plates, compare them to geolocate them, right, conduct this kind of forensic investigation of these claims. And so this kind of skepticism is really paired with these religious ideals to come together to create this very powerful kind of community, powerful vision that gets taken up and adopted in very deep ways by a particular group of followers. And in that sense, we see the different ways then, right, from friendly hate, playful, righteous hate, in which these digital platforms, these environments can normalize and mobilize these ideologies. And I really get into this in the first chapter of the book, talking about what is new and what isn't new, right, about this kind of hate. And so it's clear, of course, that, these forms of antagonism, these antipathies have been around for a very long time in one sense, right? They're sort of ancient. When we think about things like racism, sexism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and so on, right? These are not new forces in our world, right? Very established for a very long time. And so in that sense, in the kind of the heart that I call this, these forms of hate have been around for forever, essentially. But what is new, I think, is that what I call the network, right? And the network is kind of shorthand for network infrastructure, for internet technologies, for digital platforms, and so on. And the way in which these contemporary technologies then reconfigure the way in which hate is produced and organized and distributed. And in many senses, it's a kind of a repackaging, right, of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and so on. And this redistribution, this repackaging, then I think has a number of really important byproducts or impacts. And one of those, I think, is the way in which digital hate alters the way in which hate is framed and perceived, right? So in a lot of the instances I talk about in the book, then we wouldn't necessarily call this hate, right, with a capital H or something. It never quite arrives at maybe what we might consider to be hate, or at least the traditional definitions of how hate is kind of classified, particularly when we get into extremism and so on. So digital hate then alters what hate is defined as, I think. It changes the behaviors associated with hate, so it creates new practices, updates others. It reworks the consumption and distribution of hate. So it kind of sets up new circuits for sharing these views, for spreading these ideologies, right? And one of the most important things, I think, is that digital hate really ramps up the allure of hate, right? So often what we see here is that kind of a softened approach, particularly when we compare it to traditional or more historical forms of hate speech, hate groups, and so on, right? There's no longer this kind of jump or commitment into these groups, into these communities. Instead, we see a sort of a softer, a more stepwise approach, right? Where we're able to join some of these platforms, to become accustomed or acclimated to this kind of language, to become attuned to the kinds of ideas, right? And to gradually sort of ramp up the level of extremism or the level of intensity in terms of the ideas and so on, right? And so we sort of see this kind of mainstreaming of hate and the ways in which digital platforms, digital infrastructures really provide new ways to produce and consume these kinds of ideas. And all of that, I think, makes this digital hate quite novel, quite fluid in a way, and difficult to grasp, right? How does it work? How does it operate? How does it alter our traditional definitions of how these kinds of things play out? And the book really then tries to understand the logic of hate, the logic of this digital hate, to make sense of why it's so alluring, why it's so compelling to so many people. So much of the book then focuses on what I call sort of being drawn into hate, right? The logic of hate, why it's compelling, why it's alluring, the ways in which it plays out, and how that then draws individuals into certain kinds of communities, draws them into more intense commitments to certain ideologies, into more radical and extreme views, right? And so much of the book then focuses on being drawn into this hate, but in the last chapter, I do talk about this idea of being drawn out of hate and what might need to happen, right, for that to work. And this is quite a contested area. I think there are many different groups and people who have different kinds of recommendations, solutions for drawing individuals away from these ideas, away from these communities. In the chapter, I talk, for example, about countering violent extremism, this sort of anti-terrorism, almost rhetorics and programs, very much linked to state agencies, right, to security, to questions of sort of national security and so on, right? And so have a very particular kind of source that they come from, and a particular way of understanding what's wrong here and what needs to be done, right? And part of those programs then is very much sort of envisioning this spectacular violent act, right? Which it gets constructed as something, terrorism, and then backtracking in order to prevent that act, right? And in the chapter I suggest, I think that, hate doesn't necessarily play out in that way in many of these cases, right? What we tend to see in these case studies throughout the book, there are, of course, certain instances of, violent acts in the so-called real world. But in many cases, we see individuals sort of drawn into a kind of hate and who then, distribute these ideas, who bring other people on board, who do carry out harms in the world. But those harms never really arise or never really reach the level at which these kind of counterterrorism programs and definitions describe, right? So hate plays out quite differently, but it does cause harm, right, in the real world. And so I think I suggest in that chapter, then we need kind of new definitions, new concepts of new ways to frame, right, what this digital hate is and how we might deal with it. And in the chapter, then I talk about the fact there is no silver bullet solution to this problem, but I think reframing it is a start, right? So rather than seeing these kinds of individuals as sort of future terrorists or bombs in the shape of bodies, right? We see them as people. And the recovery then, rather than sort of anti-radicalization or so on, I suggest this word of recovery. Recovery then is very much about trying to treat the person as a whole person and to bring them back to kind of a holistic, human-centered place, right? One of the things that we see when we think about radicalization, about people going down these paths, being drawn into hate, is that they have a narrowing of interests, right? Their friends drop away, their other interests drop away, and they kind of have this funneling effect, right? So I suggest one way to then draw them out of hate is to reverse this funnel, to gradually direct them in particular ways to become more holistic, more expansive, to connect with their friends or family again, to become interested in other parts of the world. Part of that might be stepping away from the computer or the device, right? Touching grass, as some ex-radicals talk about. For some others, though, digital technologies might actually be one pathway towards recovery, right? And we see several kind of quite popular groups linked to QAnon, for example, about which deal with sort of ex-members, right, ex-believers, and their stories, right, of how they emerged from these communities and got back to a place that they wanted to be in. And so again, there are no single silver bullet solutions, but I suggest that there are kind of a series of actions that might be taken to leave these echo chambers, to step away from these toxic ideas, and to arrive back at a place that is more communal, more inclusive, right, more progressive, and that would ultimately benefit both themselves and the kinds of societies that we want to be seeing.